The applause started before he finished the last slide. I was sitting in the third row of the Hargrove Group boardroom, 11 feet from the screen, watching 12 people give a standing ovation to a presentation I had written, a strategy one had built, and a client relationship I had spent 14 months cultivating from a cold email into a signed $12.3 million contract. My name was not on a single slide. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched Richard Hale accept the congratulations of people who did not know I existed, and I thought, let him have today. He was going to need it. My name is Camille Okafor. I am 44 years old, and for 14 years I was a senior business development manager at Hargrove Group, a mid-sized management consulting firm headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We served mid-market companies in financial services, healthcare administration, and industrial operations, the kind of clients who needed someone to tell them what was broken and how to fix it, and who paid well for the privilege of being told. I was the person who found those clients. In 14 years, I had sourced or co-sourced $47.8 million in new client revenue. I had built Hargrove's financial services pipeline from 11 active prospects to 63. I had developed the client acquisition sequencing framework, internally called CSF, which everyone pronounced CASIFF, and which was, in plain terms, the system that told our business development team exactly when to reach out to a prospect, what to say, and in what order, based on their industry cycle, budget timing, and organizational pain points. Before CSF, Hargrove's average time from first contact to signed contract was 22 months. After CSF, it was 9. That difference was worth approximately $6.2 million in accelerated revenue per year. I had also built the Hargrove Relationship Intelligence Database, which tracked every meaningful touchpoint with every prospect and client, who had spoken to whom, what had been discussed, what had been promised, and what the next move was. It was the institutional memory of the entire business development function. Without it, the team was working from personal notes and optimism. I had missed my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner because a prospect in the healthcare space had a narrow window for a final pitch call, and I was the only one who knew the account well enough to run it. We signed them 6 weeks later. $3.1 million, 3-year engagement. I had also spent 4 months of evenings and weekends building the Meridian Consolidated Pitch, the $12.3 million deal Richard Hale just accepted a standing ovation for, because Meridian was the kind of account that required a level of preparation that could not happen between 9 and 5 without neglecting everything else. I want to be precise about what Richard Hale contributed to the Meridian deal. He attended 2 of the 7 client meetings. He forwarded 1 email. He approved the final contract summary after I had already sent it to legal. That was it. Richard Hale was 51 years old and had been vice president of business development at Hargrove Group for 6 years. He was my direct supervisor. He was also the kind of man who had learned, very early in his career, that proximity to results was almost as good as producing them, and that in a company where the people who did the work were not in the room when the credit was distributed, proximity was often sufficient. He was not incompetent in the way that makes people obviously dangerous. He was incompetent in the way that makes people quietly corrosive, smooth enough to manage upward, vague enough to avoid accountability, and skilled at the specific art of being present at the finish line of other people's races. He wore good suits. He had a firm handshake. He said things like, "We need to be more intentional about our pipeline velocity," in meetings where the people who actually managed the pipeline were sitting right there. Our director of client strategy, a woman named Priya Anand who had been at Hargrove for 9 years and who had the quality of someone who notices everything and says only what is necessary, had a phrase for Richard's management style. "He curates," she said once, after a quarterly review where he had presented her market segmentation work as a leadership initiative. "He curates," I agreed. "One day," she said, "someone's going to ask him to produce something from scratch." "Yes," I said. "That'll be interesting." I had been watching Richard take credit for other people's work for 6 years. I had watched him present Priya's segmentation model as a strategic pivot. I had watched him describe our junior analyst Marcus Webb's competitive research as directional thinking I've been developing. I had watched him accept a firm-wide recognition award for client retention improvements that Marcus and I had built together over 18 months. I had said nothing. Not because I was afraid. Because I was watching. There is a difference between a man who takes credit and a man who understands the work. Richard was the first kind. He could describe results. He could not replicate them. That distinction was going to matter. The Meridian deal closed in October. The board presentation was November 8th. I know the date because I have the calendar invite, which lists Richard Hale as the sole presenter and does not include my name anywhere in the attendee list. I found out I was not presenting my own work 3 days before the meeting, when Richard sent me a calendar update with a note that said, "I'll be handling the board presentation directly. Please send me the full deck and talking points by end of day Wednesday." I sent him the deck. I sent him the talking points. I sent him the client background, the deal timeline, the relationship history, and the strategic rationale for every decision we had made over 14 months. I also sent myself a copy of everything. Dated. Organized. Archived. Then I sat in the third row and watched him get a standing ovation. Afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Richard found me. "Good work on the prep materials," he said. "Thank you," I said. He straightened his jacket. The board was very impressed. I could see that. He smiled. "Big win for the team." "Yes," I said. "It was." He walked away. I watched him go and thought about the word team and what it means when one person uses it to describe work that another person did alone. Then I went back to my desk and started building the next one. What Richard did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never asked, was how the Meridian deal had actually been built. Not the outcome. The architecture. CSF was not a template. It was a living system. It required someone who understood the logic behind it to operate it correctly. The sequencing decisions, when to reach out, what angle to use, which internal champion to cultivate first, how to time the proposal relative to the client's budget cycle, those decisions were not in the deck. They were not in the talking points. They were in my head, built from 14 years of pattern recognition and a database that only I fully understood how to read. The Hargrove Relationship Intelligence database had 4,200 entries. It tracked not just contact history but behavioral signals, which prospects went quiet before signing, which ones needed a third-party reference call, which ones required a specific type of case study to move from interested to committed. I had been building and refining that database since year 3. It was the most complete picture of Hargrove's business development intelligence that existed anywhere in the company. Richard had access to the database. He had never learned to use it beyond the basic contact log. I knew this because I had offered to walk him through the full system twice. Both times he had said he would circle back when the timing was better. The timing had never been better. I also knew something else. In January, 3 months after the Meridian presentation, the board was going to ask for a replication plan. That was standard Hargrove practice after a major win. The board wanted to know how to do it again. They would ask Richard to present a pipeline strategy showing how Meridian-scale deals could be sourced and closed systematically. I knew this because I had been at Hargrove for 14 years, and I had watched this cycle happen 4 times before. I also knew that Richard had no idea how to answer that question. Not because he was careless. Because he had never been in the room where the actual work happened. He had the slides. He did not have the system. So I did what I always do when I see something coming. I prepared. On November 12th, 4 days after the board presentation, I met with my attorney. Her name was Sandra Osei, no relation, and she specialized in employment contracts and intellectual property in professional services. I had worked with her once before when Hargrove had tried to expand my non-compete clause without additional compensation, and she had the quality of someone who reads fine print the way other people read headlines. I brought her the CSF documentation, the database architecture, the Meridian deal timeline, the emails showing my authorship of the strategy, the calendar invites showing Richard's limited involvement in the client meetings, the prep materials I had sent him 3 days before the board presentation. She reviewed everything and said, "You built this." Yes. And the company knows you built it? The people who do the work know. The people who attend board presentations know what they were told. She nodded. What do you want? I want to be in the right position when the board figures out the difference. She said, then let's make sure your documentation is airtight. We spent 2 hours organizing the record. Every version of every document. Every email thread showing origination. Every client communication that bore my name. Every database entry I had created. Every CSF decision log that showed my reasoning in real time. By the time I left her office, I had a complete, time-stamped record of 14 years of work that could not be attributed to anyone else without a very creative interpretation of the facts. I also had something else. I had been quietly maintaining a separate professional portfolio, not on company systems, not in company formats, but in my own archive, since year 7. Not because I was planning to leave. Because I had watched what happened to people at Hargrove when leadership changed and institutional memory became inconvenient. I had watched a 15-year veteran get walked out in 2018 and watched the company spend 8 months trying to reconstruct client relationships she had built over a decade. I had decided, very quietly, that I would not be reconstructed. The portfolio contained anonymized versions of every major strategy one had developed. Methodology documents. Framework logic. Decision trees. The kind of material that demonstrated, without revealing client confidences, exactly how I thought and what I built. It was not a weapon. It was a record. And in January, when the board asked Richard Hale to show them how to replicate the Meridian result, it was going to become the most important document in the building. I went back to work. I kept building the pipeline. I kept running CSF. I kept updating the database. I kept doing the work that Richard would describe in meetings as our strategic momentum. I said nothing about November 8th. Not to Priya. Not to Marcus. Not to anyone. Priya noticed anyway. She stopped by my desk in late November, coffee in hand, and said, "You're very calm for someone who just watched her best work presented without her name on it." "I'm always calm," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You're building something." "I'm doing my job, Camille." She sat down in the chair across from me. "I've worked with you for 9 years. You don't just do your job. You do your job and 3 other things simultaneously that nobody knows about until they matter." I looked at her. "The board is going to ask him to replicate it in January." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Then, he can't." "No. He doesn't know how you did it." "No." She looked at her coffee. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm going to let him present." She looked up. And then I'm going to be available," I said, "when they have questions." Marcus Webb came to me in December. Marcus was 29, had been at Hargrove for 3 years, and had the quality of someone who is very good at his job and very aware that the people above him are not always good at theirs. He ran competitive research and prospect intelligence, and he had contributed significantly to the Meridian background analysis. He had also not been mentioned in the board presentation. He sat down across from me and said, without preamble, "Richard's been asking me for the Meridian methodology." I looked up from my screen. "What kind of asking?" "The kind where he says, 'Walk me through your process,' and then writes things down and doesn't ask follow-up questions." "When did this start?" 2 weeks ago. He's asked me 3 times. I thought about that. "What have you told him?" "The surface stuff. The research framework. The prospect scoring model." He paused. "Not the CSF integration. Not the database logic. I don't actually know how you connect those pieces. I just know you do." "That's fine," I said. He looked at me carefully. "He's going to present in January, and he's going to get it wrong. Probably. And you're not going to warn him." "No." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then, is this going to be bad?" "For him," I said, "yes. And for us." I looked at him. "Not if you keep doing your job exactly the way you've been doing it." He nodded slowly. "Okay." He stood up. "Camille." "Yes." "I've been keeping copies of my research contributions. Dated. In my own files." I looked at him for a long moment. "Good," I said. The January board meeting was scheduled for the 19th. Richard had been preparing for 6 weeks. I know this because he had asked me 4 questions during that time, each one more revealing than the last. In week 1, what was the primary driver of Meridian's decision timeline? In week 2, how did you identify their internal champion? In week 3, can you send me the CSF logic for financial services prospects? In week 4, what's the database filter you use for budget cycle alignment? I answered each question. Accurately. Completely. In isolation. What I did not do was explain how the pieces connected. Because that was not what he asked. He asked for ingredients. He did not ask for the recipe. And I had learned over 14 years that the difference between ingredients and a recipe is the difference between a list and a result. He had the list. On January 17th, 2 days before the board meeting, Richard sent me a calendar invite. Subject: BD Strategy Presentation, Final Review. I accepted. We sat in his office for 40 minutes. He walked me through his slides. They were clean. Well designed. Confident in the way that slides are confident when the person who built them does not fully understand what they are saying. He had the meridian outcome. He had the surface metrics. He had a replication framework that described, in broad strokes, the kind of pipeline activity that produced large deals. What he did not have was the sequencing logic, the behavioral signal analysis, the database integration, the specific decision points that turned a 14-month relationship into a signed contract. He had the shape of the strategy without the substance. I sat across from him and said, "The slides look good." He straightened them on his desk. "I think the board will be pleased." "I'm sure they'll have questions," I said. He smiled. "That's what Q&A is for." I nodded. "Good luck on the 19th. He said, "Thanks for the support, Camille. You've been a real asset on this." An asset. I picked up my notebook and walked back to my desk. The board meeting was at 9 a.m. on a Thursday. I was not invited. I sat at my desk and worked on a prospect analysis for a healthcare administration company in Raleigh that I had been developing since October. I updated the database. I ran the CSF sequencing for 3 new financial services prospects. I ate lunch at my desk. At 2:14 p.m., Priya appeared in my doorway. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at me with the expression of someone who has witnessed something they had predicted and finds no satisfaction in being right. Then she said, "It was bad." "How bad?" She came in and sat down. He got through the first 3 slides fine. The meridian recap. The headline numbers. The board was nodding. And then Margaret Cho asked him to walk through the acquisition sequencing. Margaret Cho was the board's lead independent director. She had been on the Hargrove board for 7 years and had the quality of someone who has heard a great many confident presentations and has learned to distinguish confidence from comprehension. "What did he say?" I asked. Priya looked at the wall for a second. He said the sequencing was relationship-driven and contextually adaptive. I looked at her. She asked him to be more specific, Priya continued. He said the team used a proprietary engagement framework calibrated to client readiness signals. He used the word calibrated. Twice. I thought about Richard writing things down in Marcus's office without asking follow-up questions. Then what? Then David Park asked him how long the replication cycle would take for a comparable deal. David Park was the board's finance chair. He had the quality of someone who had spent 30 years asking questions that sounded simple and were not. What did Richard say? Priya exhaled. He said 12 to 18 months, depending on market conditions. The Meridian deal took 14 months, I said. With CSF. Without it, the historical average was 22. I know, she said. Margaret Cho knows too. She asked him what had changed in the process to get it to 14. And? He said, enhanced team alignment and strategic focus. I sat back in my chair. Enhanced team alignment. Margaret asked him to name the team members who drove the Meridian acquisition, Priya said. There was a pause. He said, the Business Development Group. I looked at Priya. She looked at me. He didn't say your name, she said. No, I said. He wouldn't. Camille. Her voice was careful. Margaret Cho asked him directly. She said, who built the client acquisition framework you're describing? And he said, it's a collaborative methodology developed under my leadership. The room was very quiet. And then? I asked. And then David Park said, we'd like to speak with the person who actually built it. I looked at the prospect analysis open on my screen. The Raleigh Healthcare Company. 14 months of careful, patient, invisible work already in progress. My phone buzzed. Email. From Margaret Cho's assistant. Subject: Board request, meeting at 4 p.m. today. Conference room Apex. Please confirm attendance. I read it once. Then I typed, confirmed. I looked at the clock. 2:31 p.m. I had 90 minutes. I opened my portfolio. I had 90 minutes and a portfolio I had been building for 7 years. I did not panic. I do not panic. Panic is what happens when you have not prepared, and I had been preparing for this specific moment since November 8th, when I sat in the third row and watched 12 people applaud work they did not know was mine. I opened the portfolio on my laptop and went through it the way a surgeon checks instruments before an operation. Not because I was nervous. Because precision matters, and I wanted to walk into conference room Apex with exactly what was needed and nothing that wasn't. The portfolio had everything. The original CSF documentation, dated March of the year I built it, with version history showing every refinement over 11 years. The Meridian deal timeline, from the first cold email in September of the prior year through the signed contract in October, with my name on every client-facing communication. The database architecture I had designed for the relationship intelligence system, with a plain language summary of what it did and why it worked. The prep materials I had sent Richard 2 days before the November board presentation, time-stamped, complete, authored by me. And one more thing. A single-page document I had prepared in December, after my meeting with Sandra Osei, that I called the Acquisition Intelligence Summary. It was not a legal document. It was not a threat. It was a clean, precise account of what I had built, how I had built it, and what Hargrove's business development function would look like without it. I had written it in the same tone I use for everything, factual, specific, and completely without drama. I printed 3 copies, put them in a folder, and walked to conference room Apex at 3:58 p.m. The room was on the 14th floor, which was the board floor, which was a floor I had been to exactly twice in 14 years. It had a different quality than the rest of the building. Quieter carpet. Better light. The kind of furniture that communicates, without saying anything, that the people who sit in it make decisions that affect the people who don't. Margaret Cho was already there. David Park was beside her. 2 other board members I recognized but had not spoken to directly. And at the far end of the table, looking like a man who had recently discovered that confidence and competence are not the same thing, was Richard Hale. He looked at me when I walked in. I looked at him. Then I sat down, set my folder on the table, and waited. Margaret Cho spoke first. "Ms. Okafor," she said, "thank you for coming on short notice." "Of course," I said. "We've been reviewing the Meridian acquisition and the replication strategy presented this morning." She paused. "We have some questions about the methodology. I'm happy to answer them." Richard shifted in his chair. Small movement. Tight jaw. Margaret said, "Can you walk us through how the Meridian deal was actually structured?" From origination. So I did. I started with the first cold email. I explained the CSF sequencing logic in 2 sentences, the system that told us when to reach out, what to say, and in what order, based on the client's budget cycle and organizational pressure points. I described how I had identified Meridian's internal champion through the database's behavioral signal tracking. I walked through the 7 client meetings, the specific objections we had addressed, the timing of the proposal relative to their fiscal year close. I spoke for 11 minutes without notes. When I finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when people are recalibrating. David Park said, "Who built the client acquisition framework?" "I did," I said. "I built CSF in year 3 of my tenure. I've been refining it for 11 years. And the database? Also mine. I designed the architecture in year 7. I've maintained it since." Margaret Cho looked at Richard. Richard said, "Camille has been a key contributor to the team's methodology development." Key contributor. I opened my folder and slid the acquisition intelligence summary across the table. 1 copy to Margaret. 1 to David. 1 to the board member on Margaret's left. This is a summary of the systems I built, the timeline of the Meridian acquisition, and the documentation showing authorship, I said. I thought it might be useful context. Margaret picked it up. Read the first page. Turn to the second. David Park read his copy without looking up for a full minute. Richard did not have a copy. I had printed 3. That was not an accident. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. By the end of it, Margaret Cho had asked Richard 4 questions he could not answer with specificity, and I had answered all 4 before he finished not answering them. Not to embarrass him. Because the board needed accurate information and I was the person who had it. At 4:47 p.m., the same time of day I noticed as the email that had started all of this, Margaret Cho said, "Ms. Okafor, we'd like to continue this conversation. Are you available tomorrow morning?" "Yes," I said. Richard said, "I think we should align internally before." "Thank you, Richard," Margaret said. That was all she said. He stopped talking. I picked up my folder and walked out of conference room Apex, and I thought, there it is. The moment when the board stops looking at the person who presented and starts looking for the person who built it. I had been waiting for that moment since November 8th. It had arrived exactly on schedule. The next morning, I came back to the 14th floor at 9 o'clock. This time Richard was not in the room. Margaret Cho, David Park, and the firm's managing partner. A man named Gerald Whitmore who had founded Hargrove 23 years ago and who had the quality of someone who had built something real and knew the difference between people who built things and people who described them, were seated at the table. Gerald spoke first. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. "I was in the room on November 8th, he said. "I gave a standing ovation to a presentation that was not Richard's work. I should have known better. I didn't ask the right questions." I said, "I appreciate that." "I'm asking them now," he said. "What would it take to keep you at Hargrove?" And there it was. Not a desperate phone call. Not a panicked email. A direct question from the man who built the company, sitting across a table on the 14th floor, asking me what I needed. I had thought about this moment carefully. Not obsessively. Carefully. The way I think about everything. I said, "I'll tell you exactly what it would take." Gerald nodded. "First, my role. I want the Vice President of Business Development title. Not acting, not interim. Permanent, with a seat at the leadership table and direct board access when pipeline strategy is discussed." Margaret made a note. Second, compensation. My current base is $140,000. I want $290,000. A $60,000 signing bonus. And 1.5% equity in the firm's revenue growth above the current baseline, vesting over 3 years. David Park looked up from his notepad. Not with objection. With the expression of someone doing math and finding it reasonable. Third, full authority over business development strategy, CSF deployment, and the relationship intelligence database. No executive overrides on methodology. No one touches the system architecture without my written approval. Agreed, Gerald said. Fourth, Marcus Webb is promoted to Senior Business Development Analyst with a 25% salary increase and a written acknowledgement of his contributions to the Meridian acquisition and the competitive research function. Gerald said, "Done." Fifth, I said, a formal internal report documenting the November 8th presentation, the authorship of the Meridian strategy, and the events of the January board meeting. It goes into the company record. Legal reviews it. The board sees it. The room was quiet. Margaret said, "That's reasonable." From the doorway, because Richard had apparently been standing in the hallway and had apparently decided this was the moment to enter, came Richard Hale's voice. "That's not reasonable," he said. "That's a liability document." I did not turn around immediately. I let the sentence finish existing in the room. Then I turned. Richard was standing in the doorway in a very good suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have not earned them correctly, but without conviction. His face had the expression of a man who had spent the last 18 hours understanding, for the first time, that proximity to results has a shelf life. "It's an accurate document," I said. "It will damage the firm's reputation internally." "The January board presentation already did that," I said. "The report explains why." He looked at Gerald. "You can't be seriously considering putting this in writing." Gerald said, "Richard. One word. The kind of one word that ends a conversation." Richard stopped talking. Gerald looked at me. "The report will be completed. Legal will oversee it. You have my word." I looked at him for a moment. Gerald Whitmore had built Hargrove from 11 employees and a rented office in Charlotte. He had the quality of someone who understood, at a cellular level, what it cost to build something real. I believed him. "Then we have a deal," I said. I did not smile. I did not exhale dramatically. I picked up my folder and said, "I can start Monday." Gerald said, "Thank you, Camille." It was the first time anyone at Hargrove had used my first name in a sentence that also contained gratitude. It felt correct. I walked out of the 14th floor and took the elevator down to my desk, where I had a prospect analysis for a healthcare company in Raleigh that I had been building since October, and that was, by my estimate, about 4 months from a signed contract. I updated the database. Then I went home and made dinner while it was still light outside. Monday morning, I came in through the main entrance at 8:45. Not early enough to seem eager. Not late enough to seem indifferent. Exactly on time, which is what I always am. Priya was waiting near the elevator bank with 2 coffees. She handed me one without saying anything. I took it. "Vice President," she said. "Yes." She looked at the badge in my hand. New. Different color from the old one. The kind of small physical detail that communicates, without announcement, that something has changed. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought about November 8th. The 3rd row. The applause. Richard straightening his jacket in the hallway and saying big win for the team. "Accurate," I said. She smiled. "That's the most Camille answer possible." Marcus was at his desk when I came through the business development corridor. He stood up when he saw me, which he had never done before, and then looked slightly embarrassed about it. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. He sat. "Senior Business Development Analyst," he said. "That's a real title. It's the title that matches the work you've been doing for 2 years. He looked at his desk for a second. The written acknowledgement came through this morning. I know. It had my name on it. For the Meridian Research. Yes. He looked up. "Thank you." "You earned it," I said. "Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work." He nodded. "Then, what happens now?" "Now," I said, "we build the next one." The formal incident report was completed in week 3. Sandra Osei reviewed it before it went to the board. 18 pages. Clean, direct, and completely without corporate softener. It documented the November 8th presentation, the authorship of the Meridian Strategy and the CSF framework, the January board meeting, and the sequence of events that had led to the current leadership restructuring. Richard objected to the wording on page 7, which described his January presentation as containing material inaccuracies regarding the origin and development of the client acquisition methodology. Legal reviewed his objection. Legal declined to change the wording. The report went into the company record on a Thursday afternoon. I know because Sandra sent me a confirmation email at 4:47 p.m. I noticed the time. I did not mention it to anyone. Some things you keep for yourself. 8 months later, Hargrove Group's business development function looked like a different department. Not because I had rebuilt it dramatically. Because I had rebuilt it correctly, which is a quieter process and a more durable one. The CSF framework had been formally documented, version-controlled, and integrated into the firm's operational infrastructure with proper licensing terms. It was no longer a system that lived in my head and my laptop. It was a system that lived in the company's architecture, with my name on the ownership documentation and a licensing agreement that meant Hargrove paid for access to it the way companies pay for any critical tool they depend on. The relationship intelligence database had been expanded from 4,200 entries to 6,800. Marcus had built a prospect scoring module that automated the behavioral signal analysis I had previously done manually, which freed me to focus on the accounts that required judgment rather than pattern recognition. He had also developed a competitive intelligence overlay that flagged when a prospect was likely talking to a competitor based on their engagement patterns. It was, genuinely, better than what we had before. Priya had moved into a newly created role, Director of Client Strategy and Pipeline Governance. She sat between business development and delivery, which was a gap that had existed at Hargrove for years, and that everyone had noticed and no one had formalized. She ran the quarterly pipeline reviews with the kind of calm authority that made people prepare properly before walking into the room. In the 8 months since I had returned, Hargrove's business development pipeline had grown from $31 million in active prospects to $58 million. We had closed 4 new engagements totaling $19.4 million. The Raleigh healthcare company I had been building since October signed in month 3 for $0.1 million, 2-year engagement. I had not mentioned it to anyone until the contract was executed. The board noticed. Margaret Cho sent me a note after the Q3 review. Handwritten. 3 sentences. The last one said, "This is what we should have been doing for years." I kept the note. Not on my desk. In my portfolio. Richard Hale was still at Hargrove. He was Senior Vice President of External Relations now, which was a title that sounded important and meant, in practice, that he attended industry conferences, maintained relationships with trade associations, and did not touch pipeline strategy, client acquisition methodology, or anything connected to the business development function. He had a good office. He attended the right meetings. He said things like, "We need to be more intentional about our market presence," to people who nodded politely and then went back to their desks. He did not present to the board anymore. He was not destroyed. He was repositioned. Which, in a company that had learned something, is the appropriate outcome. He was good at certain things: relationships, presence, the kind of smooth external representation that trade associations reward. Those things had value. They just were not the things he had been claiming credit for. I did not avoid him. I did not seek him out. When we passed in the hallway, I said good morning, and he said good morning, and we both continued walking. That was sufficient. The total cost of the January board presentation, the missed replication opportunity, the delayed pipeline activity during the transition, the legal fees associated with the incident report process, the emergency leadership restructuring, and the 3 months of business development momentum lost while the firm sorted out what had actually happened, was calculated by finance at $6.7 million. That number appeared in the board's annual operating review, in a section titled Governance and Accountability Improvements. It did not include the cost of the standing ovation. That one was harder to quantify. My life got better in ways I had not anticipated. The salary change was real and it mattered, but that was not the part that surprised me. What surprised me was the weight that lifted when I stopped being invisible. For 14 years, I had done work that the building depended on and that the building did not see. That is a particular kind of exhaustion, not the exhaustion of hard work, which is honest and recoverable, but the exhaustion of hard work that is consistently attributed to someone else. It accumulates in ways you do not notice until it stops. It stopped. My name was on the pipeline reports now. My name was in the board materials. When a prospect signed, the announcement said who had sourced the relationship and how long it had taken. When CSF produced a result, the methodology was credited correctly. It sounds small. It was not small. In March, my sister called to tell me she was getting married again. Second wedding, smaller, backyard ceremony in Asheville. "Can you come?" she said. "The whole weekend?" I looked at my calendar. I looked at the pipeline. I looked at the governance structure I had built that meant the business development function did not require my physical presence to continue operating correctly. "Yes," I said. "I'll be there." I was there for the whole weekend. I did not check my email once. That was new. Sometimes I think about the third row. The boardroom. The applause. Richard accepting congratulations for work he had not done, in front of people who did not know the difference. The way he straightened his jacket in the hallway afterward and said big win for the team. I think about sitting there with my hands in my lap, watching it happen and making a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a plan for revenge. Just a quiet, specific decision. Let him have today, because today is the only day he has. The thing about taking credit for work you do not understand is that it works exactly once. The first time, you get the applause. The second time, you get the questions. And if you cannot answer the questions, if you never learned the system, never understood the sequencing, never built the database, never sat with the client through 7 meetings and learned what they actually needed, then the second time is the last time. Richard got 1 standing ovation. I got a title, a seat at the table, and a licensing agreement that pays me every quarter for work I built on my own time, in my own system, with my own judgment. He got today. I got everything after it. If you've ever been underestimated at work, I hope this story reminds you that quiet preparation always beats loud arrogance. If this resonated, like and subscribe. I share stories like this every week. And remember, the person who takes credit for your work can only do it once, because the second time, the board asks questions and only one of you knows the answers.